Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In accordance with Standing Order 52, I ask that we have an emergency debate on the situation in Oshawa, the Durham region, and indeed Ontario as a result of the announcement by GM today with respect to the planned closure of the operating facilities and assembly plant in Oshawa. Already we've heard 2,500 jobs at risk there, Mr. Speaker. I would suggest that it's even potentially larger. A study a few years ago suggested 4,000 direct jobs would be at risk, up to 33,000 in Southern Ontario from indirect impact on the supply chain network, which is tightly integrated in Ontario and indeed the Great Lakes manufacturing region, Mr. Speaker. A $1.1 billion hit on annual GDP to the country. And for Ontario specifically, Mr. Speaker, that study showed that after 2 years, a drop in $5.2 billion to the GDP of Ontario as a result of closure of General Motors of Oshawa operations, Mr. Speaker. There are many questions to ask with respect to why Oshawa was not considered part of GM's global competitive future, Mr. Speaker. Historically, the productivity levels of the workers in Oshawa, and they live throughout the Durham region, has been unparalleled, Mr. Speaker. The flexibility the line offers there allows for multiple products, both from trucks, which are hot selling now, through to sedans and others. What were the circumstances, Mr. Speaker? This is going to impact thousands in Ontario. We have to explore what the tariff, steel and aluminum, and the retaliatory tariffs had possibly on this decision or the economic conditions. NAFTA, the free trade agreement, I would add, we saw a USMCA tabled, but we would not have free trade in Canada, Mr. Speaker, with our U.S. partners were it not for GM Oshawa, the epicenter of the auto industry, which led to free trade in the Auto Pact between Canada and the U.S. in 1965. That's how fundamental autos have been. And since that time, Canadians in Oshawa, people from General Motors in the area, my father, when I was young, Mr. Speaker, have produced cars, 85% of which were sold into the U.S. So trade tariffs is fundamental here, Mr. Speaker. We also have to look on the threat posed by President Trump with respect to 232 tariffs on the auto, the potential imposition. Did that have anything to do with it? As well as the regulatory and tax environment in Ontario. It was noted that the government was planning to exempt General Motors from their carbon tax scheme, Mr. Speaker, but certainly smaller and medium-sized parts suppliers in their network across Southern Ontario were not going to be exempt. I would end with this, Mr. Speaker. This has been over a century, since in the late 1800s, when the McLaughlin family from Inniskillen started making carriages, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, my community of Bowmanville wouldn't lend the family some money years later, so they moved it to Oshawa. And the McLaughlin Carriage Company and later McLaughlin Motors was not just the epicenter of the auto industry in Canada. Sam McLaughlin was a director and original investor in the General Motors Corporation itself, Mr. Speaker. So the auto industry and General Motors owes its success to McLaughlin Buick and his partnership with Mr. Durant that led to the General Motors we had today. We can express our sympathy for the families impacted, Mr. Speaker, but on this side, we do not want to explore giving up on the conditions that led to this decision. From being a world-class plant with the best employers, the best position within the North American marketplace, what has changed to make us be one of the plants named today, Mr. Speaker? We owe it as parliamentarians to bring this debate to the floor. I'm glad others have echoed our sentiment for this, Mr. Speaker. So according to Standing Order 52, I hope that you allow us the opportunity to advance the interest of our constituents and this wider issue that will impact all Canadians.